What's on your radar, Ryan?
Well, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced yesterday that the Senate plans to push ahead by January 17th with an effort to reform the filibuster so that voting rights and election integrity legislation only need a simple majority in order to pass. The current filibuster rules are assumed by many people to go all the way back to the country's founding, but in fact they date only to 1975. The filibuster itself was brought into being by Vice President Aaron Burr when he tweaked Senate rules to remove the mechanism that had previously been deployed to end debate. It wasn't needed, Burr reasoned, since it had never really been used, and it was impossible to conceive that real gentlemen would block the will of a majority beyond the time they needed to say their piece. The filibuster was rarely used, and in 1917, a rule was finally put in place that would enable debate to be ended. You needed the votes of 2/3 of the senators who were present and voting, which meant that the minority could block a bill, but they had to stay close to the Senate and stay aware. In 1975, Robert Byrd and other senators pushed to reform the rule again, this time to change the threshold to 3/5 of those present and voting. The minority fought back, and after weeks of filibustering, a compromise was reached, and the rule was made that 3/5 of those serving in the Senate, rather than present and voting, would be needed to end debate. So in other words, you now needed 60 votes, no matter how many people in the minority showed up. For the next 20 to 30 years, the Senate continued passing things by majority vote, with the filibuster rarely deployed. Often, senators would vote yes on the cloture motion. That meant ending the debate and moving to a final vote, but then vote against the final bill. In the mid-2000s, that started to change, first under Harry Reid and then under Mitch McConnell. And senators who opposed a bill would also oppose ending debate on it. Ever since, the Senate has slowly stopped functioning. The filibuster has been reformed twice since then, once by Reid and once by McConnell. And all major legislation now gets pushed through using the arcane tool of budget reconciliation. Across the country, Republican legislatures are passing new restrictions on voting, claiming they're doing so in the name of election integrity. And they're attempting to seize partisan control of election commissions, trying to take the power to declare who won an election and give it to themselves. Former President Trump says he plans to commemorate January 6th by celebrating it as a good thing, a legitimate effort to stop an election from being stolen. That's where Trump's party wants to go from here. At the federal level, Democrats have written legislation, drafted in fact by Joe Manchin, to put nonpartisan officials back in charge of counting votes, to end gerrymandering, and to protect mail-in voting, but they can't pass the bill without doing something about the filibuster. Now, Schumer might not end up having the votes to reform the filibuster across the board. Sinema has said she's against it, and Manchin's position is unclear. But he has good reason to try this month. For one, if Schumer fails, he might still be able to get a carve-out for voting rights. And second, he needs something to occupy the January calendar while Democrats rewrite the Build Back Better Act to satisfy Manchin's concerns and salvage something from the wreckage. He's also getting enormous pressure from donors and civil rights groups to get serious about voting rights, and this will let him put Manchin and Sinema on record one way or the other. So Manchin has spent months searching in vain for 10 Republicans to back voting rights legislation, and instead he has found exactly one. That's Lisa Murkowski. But she has told colleagues that if Democrats reform the filibuster, then her support of the voting rights bill goes away. So in other words, she's only for the bill if it can't become law. If it can become law, then she's against it. The word for that is opposition. She's opposed to the voting rights bill, no matter what she says. Inside the Senate, the push for reform of the filibuster is framed around the idea of making the Senate actually function again. Swing state Democrats like John Tester, Angus King, and Tim Kaine, who are by no means radicals — King isn't even a Democrat — have been making the case to Manchin that the only way to save the Senate is to fix it. Outside the Senate, filibuster reform is simply assumed to be good politics and good policy. Connor Lamb, who's ostensibly running as the centrist in the Pennsylvania Democratic Senate race, launched this ad yesterday.
I will vote to end the filibuster. Republicans are abusing it to block voting rights and endanger our democracy, to block health care and child care and union protections. We have to win this Senate seat to end the filibuster. It's that simple.
Connor Lamb's biggest national endorsement so far is from none other than Joe Manchin. Sinema, for her part, has claimed that nobody has talked to her about any of these proposals. The truth is that she refused to meet with anybody about them and routinely skips caucus meetings if the filibuster is on the agenda. Democrats have scheduled another caucus meeting on the filibuster for this afternoon, so we'll find out if she bothers to show up. So do you think this is theater, or do you think they actually are at that Cinnamon Mansion come around and do something about this?
I think Sinema has a not entirely irrational view that it's better to keep the filibuster because the Republicans will soon have the majority, and the minority in the Senate does want the filibuster to thwart the majority from getting its way. I mean, this is kind of, this is a problem because both sides have this incentive when they spend when they take their turn in the minority, and you do want to thwart the majority from a gamesmanship perspective. Now, obviously, does it make a lot of sense? No, our founders did not intend for it to require 60 votes to pass legislation in the Senate. They required it to take 51 votes. That was how they engineered it to be.
That's why the vice president breaks the tie. Vice president doesn't make the 60th vote.
Right. This quirk has evolved, and it's a funny and very, wildly preventative of legislation passing kind of quirk that is hard to justify on its own. But I think it can be tactically justified for the people in the minority, and both parties take turns in the minority. And
Mitch McConnell loves the current setup because through reconciliation you can do tax cuts. Mm-hmm. That's his big priority.
Yep.
He
judges get this exception, right?
Judges, his second big priority.
Yep.
Yeah, because Reid reformed it for judges below the Supreme Court level. McConnell then reformed it for Supreme Court judges. And so then he can say to his right-wing base on all of their social legislation that they want and all of the things that he doesn't have any interest in doing at all, gee, I would love to do that, but man, I don't have the 60 votes for it. So I think that's the main reason I think he would prefer that it stays there.
Seems to work out okay for this guy right here, who just likes tax cuts and, like some of the Republican justices, judge picks are okay, and doesn't want that regressive social agenda passed.
Yeah, you're like, make it 100. Cloture vote should be 100.
Yeah.
We'll see.
But no, it's hard to imagine it not getting. I mean, the institution itself is crumbling. The Senate.
Right, and it's becoming. People say, "Oh, it's going to become just like the House." Well, not. There's all sorts of things that distinguish it from the House. But one thing that is becoming houseified on the Senate side is the partisan nature of it. Like the leadership is controlling its caucus, both on the Democratic and Republican side, in a way that just wasn't true before. It used to have all these committee chairs that had their own fiefdoms, that were independent, that were independent power centers. And that's just not the case anymore. The only independent power centers are now the ones who make the difference between a majority and a minority. Like in this case, it's Joe Manchin. Because he's the 50th vote, it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that he runs the Energy Committee. That's good for you, you run the Energy Committee, but everything runs through the leadership office. But it's Manchin's vote that enables Schumer to be the leader, which makes him so pivotal.
The only other thing I wanted to add is so when we talk about voting rights legislation, I'm often curious, what specific reforms are we talking about? Because, I agree that it should be easy to vote. I think Republican efforts to make it harder to vote are bad and in the long term self-sabotaging because you're a political coalition. You have to, if your strategy is to stop people from voting, that's in the long run not going to work. But it is legal to vote, right, for everyone under the age of 18. It's that's already the case. So I think we're often talking about requiring various identification, things like that.
Which Manchin's actually, if Manchin's version goes through, then ID will be part of it. Like he's pro-voter ID. There are several things that are in play here. And one of them is purging of the rolls. Republicans have become very fixated on the fact that there are all these illegal people on the rolls, and then they get these
dead people.
They get these very.
There are some dead people.
Sure, people die. Right. It's a fact, and they don't the family doesn't immediately unenroll them.
Right.
So what Republicans have done though is they have gotten these very sophisticated. Consultants to come in and say, how do we scrub our rolls and make it look like we're going after people who don't live in the state anymore or don't live on the planet anymore, but actually scrub out all the Democrats. And what they do, for instance, is Democrats move a lot more than Republicans. They're just more it's just a more transient population. And so if you've moved, they scrub you. If your last name is hyphenated, which is the case for a lot of Hispanic voters, but it's not hyphenated in another, in your driver's license, but it is in one particular government thing, boom, you're off the rolls. They'll also do this thing, they'll send a card that looks like junk mail, and they will have companies design it to look like junk mail. That will say, if you don't return this card and tell us that you still live at this address, then we're going to take you off the voter rolls. But if I handed you this thing, you would just throw it right in the recycling bin because it looks like the other 10 pieces of junk mail you got. And so they make sure that they target those little junk mail cards to people that they suspect are Democrats. And so the federal law would push back against that.
Yeah, that's all bad. But we're verging into a society where you're going to have to show a piece of ID just to enter.
Oh, right. That's why
subway.
That's why Democrats are basically folding on the voter ID. They're folding. Like, it's also hard for Democrats to be like, everybody must have a vaccine passport.
Right. That's exactly what I mean.
But you can't have a driver's license.
Yeah. That's the one gotcha Republican talking point that's being made a lot lately, where I'm like, yeah, that's kind of right.
And they're folding on it, but they want some things in return for it, like stop purging our people by sending them junk mail that they don't read or return.
Sounds fair to me.
All right, let's do it. All right. Team Rising joins us next.